who's done so much organizing for today. I'd like to welcome you here to the Carl. Please let us know what we can do to make you comfortable. I'll give a few house announcements. Thank you for working your way through the detour. Just for your information, Applewood, the community across the street, has for years petitioned the town of Amherst for sidewalks so they can safely cross over here to the Carl and to Hampshire College, and also on their side walk down to Atkins Farms. So that's awesome. They're finally getting what they need, but it's a little messy in the meantime. So just some quick house business. There was a little mix-up with the food, as you could tell. It is not here yet. So we're going to do a little break after Swarupa speaks to allow for time to get something to eat. So don't worry, you won't starve today. And when we move to the breakout sessions, you'll see out we call this the Great Hall. Out in the Great Hall, staff like me will be standing there with a number sign. If you look at your tag, you'll see there's a little number and a letter. That number is what you're going to look for out there. The person who's holding up that number is going to take you to your breakout session. Is that fair, Kevin? Did I do that right? And when you get to lunch at the cafe after the breakout sessions, which is all the way at the end of the hall on the right, so take a right at the giant caterpillar. In the cafe, your lunch is the letter that you chose. Last year it was hard for people to remember what type of lunch they picked, so now you have a little letter to tell you. My gratitude to the executive committee for all their hard work in making today happen, and to the Inclusion Committee, who's been doing such an incredible job of keeping inclusion, equity, and diversity at the forefront of our work here. So many thanks to them. And on that note, I would like to introduce my neighbor and friend, Susan Bronson, who's the chair of the Executive Committee.
Thanks, Alex, and welcome everybody. Again, I'm Susan Bronson. I'm chair of the Executive Committee Museums 10, and I'm the executive director of the Yiddish Book Center. I want to thank Eric Carl for hosting us, and again to Kevin Kennedy and 5 colleges for everything they did to make this possible, and to the executive committee members, Gina Hall, Erica Jacob, Sandy Soderberg, and Ned Lazaro. Thanks, you guys, who really worked hard to put this whole program together. When I began to think about who we should invite to deliver the keynote, I knew we wanted to follow up on last year's summit. The executive committee did a lot of talking about how we could best do that. We focused last year on inclusion and diversity, and with all the work the Inclusion Committee's been doing and all of the interest on our various respective institutions, we wanted to follow up on that. Fortunately, I recalled a trip I took to Detroit last spring. I was there for business, but I had a free afternoon and decided to visit the Detroit Institute of Art. I was blown away, and for those of you who haven't been there, you have to go. It's an incredible museum, and of course I enjoyed wandering through and exploring the many wonderful exhibits and the breadth of the collection. But what impressed me most was the diversity of the visitors and how engaged those visitors were. I began to do a bit of research and discovered Swarupa Anila. Swarupa is Director of Interpretive Engagement at the DIA and responsible for strategic museum-wide planning and execution of visitor-centered interpretation for exhibits and permanent collections. With nearly 2 decades of museum experience, she has led the development of award-winning interpretation and exhibitions and has produced publications on innovative and critically progressive practices for visitor-centeredness and community engagement. Anila's keynote today is entitled Building the Great Belonging. She will reflect on what it means to shift the rhetoric from welcoming to belonging, using case studies from the DIA's efforts to become a community-inclusive museum. Please join me in welcoming Swarupa Anila. Swarupa, are you back here? Oh, there she is. There she is.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Susan, for that very kind introduction and for a phone conversation that we had earlier in the year, and she was talking about her experiences at the DIA. I'm pretty grateful for that because sometimes when you're in the middle of what you do, you can't see what you do, and you forget until someone shows you with fresh eyes. So thank you, Susan. Thank you, Alex, and the team here at the Eric Carl Museum for hosting. It's been a pleasure to be invited to be part of the Museums 10 Summit. I'm looking forward to a day that will be thick with as a space for our shared voices, perspectives, and ideas. And many thanks to the executive committee, Gina Hall, Erica, Jacob, and especially Kevin Kennedy, they're incredibly supportive in helping to structure today's work. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we stand on Nonotuck land and to acknowledge neighboring indigenous nations in 4 directions: the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and Pequot to the south, the Mohican to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. My apologies for mispronunciations there. So today, what we'll do together is to think about the potential, the inspiring and valuable work of museums. We'll turn that work to the critical and necessary reparative work in ourselves, for individuals and the spaces in which we live and work. But I hope that we can open up spaces to consider the bold transformative work that becomes possible when we start to think in new ways. You'll hear me use a few words a lot today, so it's worth doing some framing at the start. So if you think about the differences between welcoming and belonging, welcoming is generous, it's about hospitality, it's open, but community is not about welcoming only. It's fundamentally about belonging. The term community, too, is fraught, as many, many people have written. It's bounded, usually porously, but still, sociologists refer to in-group and out-group, meaning that someone is included and someone is excluded. But many of you know the terms we think about now in terms of intersectional identities. Because of that, we occupy, perform in, and can be part of many communities simultaneously. So you'll hear that plural here, communities. I was listening to On Being the other week, where Krista Tippett interviews Padraig O'Tuan, again, apologies if I'm mispronouncing his name, who's a poet and theologian, and he describes belonging as making and unmaking us. Belonging in this sense isn't easy. It requires truth-telling and a reliance on each other and a clear sense of interdependencies. So when it comes to ideas of community and the museum as serving communities, as a community unto itself, the question of inclusion, who is included, and more importantly, how, and who is excluded, and more importantly, how, is what we'll look at. The first thing I'd like to do is narrow the broad definition of inclusion in all its forms a bit, and we'll focus on issues of identity related to race, racial, ethnic, and cultural representation. This kind of consideration is necessary in museums to tackle from broad, big picture thinking, board and staff diversity and inclusion, community engagement, how we build our narratives, how we build our exhibitions and program offerings. It's necessary to consider in terms of who we are, who we represent, who we serve. And for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be talking about how we dive into narratives and experiences we design for exhibitions and installations, and share examples from the Detroit Institute of Arts. Later this morning, we're going to have a breakout session where you will share your experiences, and then we'll come back together. First, I'm going to ask a question. When people are asked why they go to cultural institutions, including museums, just shout out some answers. What is the top reason that they give? The top reason people visit cultural institutions. Anyone? To learn. See something new. See something new. Inspiration. Reflection of themselves. Anyone else? Time with friends and family. Did I miss someone over here? So the number one answer is social experiences, followed in small margins by seeing exhibits, programming, etc. This is an ongoing data set from Impacts Research, with reporting that has now expanded into the millions. This finding is repeated over and again in studies of specific institutions, and perhaps with higher numbers for art museums in terms of what the first things that people mentioned today, in terms of visiting a place for seeing art, and especially the idea of sanctuary, learning. So critical to the support of any of these motivating factors are experiences of comfort, welcome, and connectedness. Numerous studies specifically about art museums show that a key motivation for visitors to that institution type is escape from the everyday, the idea that museums can provide transcendent, rejuvenating experiences. So a little bit about the Detroit Institute of Arts, where I work. It was founded in 1883. It's considered an encyclopedic or universalist collection with objects from cultures around the world and from ancient to contemporary times. With 65,000 works of art, the DIA is one of the most important art collections in the US. The DIA's mission, and I ask this every time I go somewhere to, if you work at an institution, if you know your museum's mission and vision, a lot of times people don't, I'll share with you ours. The DIA's vision is to be a town square welcoming to all. The mission is simply to create experiences that help each visitor find personal meaning in art and with each other. This is intended to integrate the motivations that we know drive people to the museum, both the experience of great art, but also that important social engagement. In order to do these two things, to achieve our mission and a vision, to be welcoming and to help each visitor find personal meaning, we need to know our audiences. We need to know who is coming, but very importantly, people who don't. We are known for being visitor-centered. So here are some findings from a satisfaction survey that the DIA has been doing for probably the past 6 years. And so from last year, is this clear enough to see? In the lower right, you'll see how we stack up to that broad survey that you saw earlier. The margins are so narrow that they're basically equal. People come in equal part to see beautiful, rare, beautiful objects, to feel welcome, to feel comfortable, to spend time with friends and family. A little bit lower on that list, but not much. Relax and escape, learn something new, reflect on art. As you can see from the top, that the overall satisfaction rankings, we're doing pretty good. People give us an overall satisfaction ranking at 90%. They're at 92% likely to recommend their experiences at the DIA. That means that in terms of a Likert scale from 1 to 10, with 9 to 10 being the highest that you can rank your experience, 90% of visitors are saying they're satisfied. It's interesting. So here's something to look at too. When we look at the DIA and carefully at our city and region's demographics and compare those to our visitation, you can begin to see a divergence. In the census from 2010, so these numbers are very rapidly changing in our area, but using those numbers, the Tri-County area is 65.4% white. The visitors to the DIA are significantly more than that percentage by parallel at 78%. I think we all know that there are problems with how the US Census takes its demographic data and how narrow its past categories have been, how they're opening up, how there's a new area being advocated for with immigration status. There's, based on what we know and how we can fill in with local information, we can fill in a little bit of Arab American and Chaldean populations, which are folded into white traditionally in the census. With African Americans, the city of Detroit is about 80% plus African American. In the Tri-County region, it's 24.6%. Our visitors are 10%, even if we're in the middle of Midtown in Detroit. You see the rest of the numbers that we have here. There are divergences. And yes, there are those numerous studies that show a key motivation for visitors to art museums is escape from the everyday, but we also know from many years of research, according to people like John Falk and Lynn Dierking, that worldwide museum visitors are disproportionately more affluent and well-educated than the general public. And in most Western countries, visitors are much more likely to be drawn from European extraction. And that bears out here at the DIA. Well, at the DIA. Maybe not here, I don't know. And that begs the question, don't people of non-European extraction also seek escape from the everyday? Don't they too seek transcendent experiences? What we find and can draw a conclusion here is to say that museums are most comfortable for particular audiences. And so some illustrative anecdotes. If you don't know this publication, it's a very useful one. Multiculturalism in Art Museums Today. The editors of this book open with their reflections on their first museum visits. Joni Boyd Acuff on the left, Laura Evans on the right. Both were young children, both girls. Both visited art museums with their schools. One felt unease, feeling she needed to look around at the other students to understand the codes of behavior. She had a sneaking sense of surveillance from security guards. She enjoyed elements of the art, but couldn't shake the discomfort. The other child felt swept away, delighted by the wonder of the space and the art. She was so taken by the experience, she skipped lunch with her school to find a corner to read in a gallery, and that caused a panic among her chaperones. Security found the joyful little child and returned her safely to her group. I'll let you guess which person had which experience. When you start listening to non-visitors and infrequent visitors, you begin to hear patterns that the same art collections and interpretive modes of display, meaning-making, the same modes that serve as sites of learning and aesthetic enjoyment for some audiences not only do not attract other audiences, but can cause them feelings of trauma and alienation. As it turns out, with the massive amount of research and data about museum visitation, motivation, and habits, there's actually a very small fraction of museum studies that get to the bottom of such disparate responses in hard statistical ways or with qualitative data. There are some who specialize in culturally responsive visitor evaluation, but that leaves us to explore that with narrow evidence that we have and to investigate firsthand accounts of visitors so we can make with them what we may. If you're not familiar with this site, I would recommend it as well. Visitors of Color is a remarkable documentation of oral histories by Nikhil Trivedi and Portia Moore. They document the perceptions, dreams, and demands of persons of color for their museums. The organizer's mission statement, we envision this as a space for museum folks to be able to learn from the perspectives of marginalized people. We also see this as a form of activism, giving folks who may not feel safe or welcome in our institutions a little bit of agency in their relationships with museums. We will continue to create space for people whose voices are often not privileged in the visioning and critique of museums. We will continue to create tools and space for museum workers to have difficult and challenging conversations about our institutions with our colleagues. We will continue to fight for a world that centers justice for all people. That's their mission. That's a pretty good mission, ambitious. Visitors of Color documents these experiences of people who do not see museums as valuable to them and reveals sharp insights into the feelings of mistrust and discomfort that many experience in our museums in America. If we look closely, certain characteristics arise in identifiable patterns: alienation, isolation, non-representativeness, exclusion, suspicion. According to Stephen Simpson, a museum studies professor in the UK, it's clear that museums are, quote, perceived by many to be unsatisfactory, serving the cultural elite, reflecting white values, and excluding from the interpretive process the very peoples whose cultures were represented in the collections, unquote. Many in the museum world are asking, what can we do? How can we assert the values of art and museums, and to informing with greater openness this field of identity politics as they play out before us and are having a real effect on people's lives and their communities, our communities. These are important questions, and they are important to ask at the same time that we really do interrogate more closely the disaffection many people feel about museums. We can't just ask, what can we do now? But we have to ask, what have we done in the past? Who are we? How have we participated in the making of this moment so we can better be cleaner in its unmaking? So there are other questions that I have. What does a major encyclopedic art museum like mine have to do with many of the events and images, ideas, and lives and deaths that we're seeing showcased in mainstream media, in the news every day? Violent, sometimes extremely violent. So, and then the questions that we ask, is it possible that the absence of imagery of black, brown, and non-white bodies in centuries-old museums that represent high culture then implicitly suggest low cultural value of non-whiteness? Do the images of women created by centuries of Western male artists highlighted in such institutions define a kind of gendering and politics that denies multiple gender expressions or self-definition? Does the extraordinary wealth associated with art collecting in museums diminish the cultural expressions of the poor and working class? Are these practices, intentionally or not, colonizing acts and forms of cultural conquest? The Brazilian educator and philosopher Paulo Freire uses an explanation here that the impact on the consciousness of those affected within these intersecting systems of power, and says, cultural conquest leads to the cultural inauthenticity of those who are invaded. They begin to respond to the values, the standards, and goals of the invaders. Those who are invaded come to see their reality from the outlook of the invaders rather from their own. They mimic the invaders, and the more stable the position of the latter becomes. White values become deeply ingrained, and they become invisible. And there's data to support this assertion. Many of you probably are familiar with the work around the Harvard Implicit Bias Project and the work of social psychologists and researchers Mahzarin Banaji and Anthony Greenwald. They bring plenty of evidence of our collective implicit biases. This is another data set that is ongoing, and it's one that drives past 14 million, establishing through an astonishing volume of respondents the depth and breadth of implicit bias. That is, their immediate responses of preferences and culturally perceived incongruencies. Their research measures, through simple tests, our immediate responses to certain identity characteristics. Collectively, we see that all of us, regardless of race, and regardless of whether it's detrimental to us personally or not, implicitly identify positive characteristics with white people and less positive or negative ones to dark-skinned and black people. I think this is worth repeating. This even among the most conscientious and racially aware individuals. And regardless of whether it is good for us or not, regardless of who we are, we will identify positive characteristics with whiteness and less positive to those persons of dark skin or Black people in particular. So it reminds of what Bell Hooks says: no one, no matter how intelligent and skillful at critical thinking, is protected against the subliminal suggestions that imprint themselves on our unconscious brain when we're watching hours and hours of television and influenced by and inundated with what happens in the mainstream media. But awareness building and critical thinking can change our thought patterns. Art museums, like other cultural institutions, play an integral role in our individual and collective image making. We also define culture. We don't just reflect it. Because museums have the quintessential potency to change what people know and think, to feel, to affect attitudes, to influence what values they form, museums influence identity formation of people who come here and those who don't. How that happens for visitors is tied to the way we know ourselves as museums and on how we perform our attitudes and values in the public sphere. So, bring us back to the DIA with these questions. How can we responsibly serve our communities or unlock our community's potential when we know that we are only considered partially representative, when our work is only thorough to some and useful to some? How do we support multiple ways of learning, knowing, and being? How do we act on behalf of, alongside, with individuals and communities to self-define through cultural and their artistic expressions? So a little bit of background, again, on the DIA. We have, a few years ago, new leadership under the director Salvador Sellert-Pons, who inherited from Graham Beal, our former director of 15 years. He inherited a stabilized financial situation with the museum. We won a millage, which is a regional property tax, to support the museum's operating funds. We won that earned that tax in 2012, and when voters in 3 counties approved the tax to support 70% of the museum's operating funds for 10 years while we raise an endowment. The support means that the DIA survived in 2015 a bankruptcy of the city through what was called a grand bargain. The DIA contributed $100 million to support city pension funds, and each of these events created new responsibilities and relationships with the residents of the city. There are new challenges: community building, community relationship building. We have a new vision for the museum, that town square to be a gathering place for all, our mission. And so every one of us is intended to ask ourselves, how do we serve our communities? How do we shift to become a community-engaged museum? So I lead the team of interpretive planners at the museum. At the outset of exhibitions, including installations of the permanent galleries, our interpretive planners are teamed with the curators, and they become thought partners in the process of developing the entire installation. The team relies heavily on other departments: design, exhibitions, and especially evaluation. This is how we come to know whether the work we're doing is effective with our visitors and hoped for audiences. So just having done this for a little while now, it's my observation and assertion, based on what we've seen happen, that when our interpretive planning process is rigorously and authentically visitor-centered and now community-engaged, the Art Museum has the potential to perform decolonizing work. That means that when we are integrating this work with the critical multicultural education, which works to investigate how cultural authority is maintained and to disrupt it, to be more inclusive. Art museum practice can itself be a form of liberatory social justice. So some of the practices I'm going to outline here for inclusion that we observe in as much of our work as possible. We have a long history of experimentation at the DIA and innovation in how we present art for a broad public, and that's ingrained visitor-centered processes in our work, but also throughout the museum. And so before the art is installed and open to the public, we do consistent work with visitors, advisors, and others to shed light on nuances, sensitivities, and distinct observations that influence decisions that the teams make in their overall planning. My team develops the baseline visitor experience structures, the learning environment. So when we say, as we enter the phases of concept development for an exhibition or installation, we look to identify gaps. So when we're looking at the content and looking at the ways that we can support visitor meaning making with the art, we have to try to identify what dominant narratives emerge and whose stories are being told. Then we try to examine who's on the other side of those power dynamics and seek art by or depicting those missing from the narrative, not only as counterpoints to the dominant narrative, but most often to show that they are interdependent. Whether art can or be added or not, content can be informed by interdisciplinary expertise. Visitor focus groups, community consultants, individuals who make up various perspectives in those gaps become indispensable to the process of identifying and filling in these gaps. This process is locating the center, decentering, and recentering based on these issues of representation, and changes the way we think. When I say create undisciplined spaces, I'm citing the work of a woman named Manisha Sharma. The idea here is while art history programs are integrating critical race theory, gender theory, identity theory, art museums, especially traditional ones like mine, are slower to acquire and interpret art through those lenses, to do new work. So the idea here is to bring in, create undisciplined spaces. That's how Manisha Sharma defines it, where the boundaries of disciplines dissipate so you find new ways of thinking. I'm going to walk through some examples of these in a moment. When we say, let me see, multiply meaning, interpretation can present multiple perspectives. Asking questions demonstrates how meaning is constructed and empowers visitors to construct meaning themselves, and it shows that the museum is an open space for the generation of ideas. So we try to include opportunities not only for visitor feedback as we're evaluating our ideas for an exhibition during the process, but also directly within the exhibition space. Participatory experiences like response stations allow visitors to share their opinions, feelings, and inquiries alongside what we consider or name sanctioned museum interpretation. And that work does a little bit of flattening of a kind of knowledge hierarchy. Do no harm. So often there's a responsibility in museums, art museums especially, to represent the intentions of art makers in their own time and cultures, and to not impose contemporary values that might diminish perceptions of the artist. I had a conversation just last week about Gauguin and a painting of a 13-year-old girl that he had made in Tahiti, and this was the exact conversation. So So it's very current, not diminishing, not crucifying the artist is the phrase that came to the table. But we can't limit the potential of the art to lift out of its past and to serve as a point of dialogue about the very issues, the discrepancies of beliefs and values and meaning. It's the opportunity that we have with these works. It's the great gift that they give us. It's also fundamentally a process that denies the legacy of the past on the present consciousness of viewers. We're limited by what we know, and often the ways that objects are perceived as oppressive are invisible to interpretive teams, curatorial and interpretive teams. Exploring art with interdisciplinary experts, as well as focus groups whose identities may be reflected in the art, can help museum staff see what our own cultural codes prevent us from seeing. Expose our own implicit biases. When I say present disruptive truths, it's critical to operate from an assumption of cultural wealth rather than difference as a deficit, something that's lost or in lack. Including counter perspectives and narratives do challenge simple readings, simplistic constructions of ideas. Critical multicultural theorists, educational theorists, call for a deep change through counter-narratives, and that means tellings of the work that synthesize notions of truth from multiple historical, sociological, personal, anecdotal, and familial sources. When we do this, we amplify voices typically unheard and surface suppressed histories. I'm going to touch on the last two bullets in a bit. And some of the methods that we use, I'll outline very quickly. Of course, there's research. Do we do literature reviews on previous exhibitions, installations? We look at how other disciplines define some of the things that come up as topics or themes within installations. But the last four bullets are about talking with people. We use advisory panels. Many of you are familiar with those, where we pull together either experts in particular disciplines or we pull together people who may self-identify as being reflected in the works that we're presenting, and they become our advisors. And these are usually groups of maybe 6 or 8 people who come to the museum. We present the overall story, the big idea, the concept of the exhibition, the themes, the objects, and really ask for critical feedback. And we'll do that on 2 occasions, early in the process, at the formative stage, and in a second stage, when things have, we've taken the feedback that we have and start designing a little bit differently, bring them back for more, for a second session. Focus groups are a visitor evaluation method where we are identifying a group of particular interest. These are different than the kind of marketing focus groups you may have heard or seen on television, where the creators, the product creators, are behind glass watching the reactions of potential consumers. In visitor panel, these are more like visitor panels, these focus groups, where we recruit people who have not visited the museum in a while or don't, and those are groups of about 8 or 10 people. For a particular community, perhaps, that we're trying to touch. And a second focus group is always paired, who represent our general visitors, or general visitorship. Staff is in the room so that there's direct contact with, we're not supposed to talk though, we don't talk to them. They have to, it's their space. And so it's different than the kind of marketing focus groups you might be familiar with, and those usually happen just once, one review with focus groups. In community consultations, this is something where it's a little bit easier to do. We go out into the community, we talk with cultural organizations, maybe a leader, and we ask them to bring the participants to the table, and we go out to their spaces, to the Interfaith Leadership Council of Metro Detroit, to any kind of we go to the Chinese American Association for the region, the Jewish Federation, and we ask a leader in that institution to gather up their participants, and we do the same work of talking about the installation, asking for feedback. And the idea there is that the advisors, the focus groups, all of that is, the participation is vetted by the museum. We're sort of picking people, we're checking their demographics. The idea behind in-community consultations is that we're on someone else's safe ground. We're in their community, we're in their space of belonging, and we need to work in their frame of culture. So they have more power to choose who comes into the room to critique our work. Community inclusive teams is a newer thing for us, where we bring members of communities directly onto the concept teams, and I'll tell you an example of that in a bit. But the idea behind using these multi-layered approaches is that we begin seeing broad trends between traditionally marginalized groups, and we begin seeing and are able to surface overlapping concerns, but also, very importantly, distinct needs and interests that we can use to exploit the collections and exhibitions to do cultural bridging work. This basically boils down to talk with people. Talk with artists, with experts, non-experts, persons whose identities may be implicated and not. Listen to them, and listen to them deeply and sincerely. I will say that in all of this, and doing this over the past 15 years, it is incredibly humbling, because you are basically testing something that you've created, something you're very proud of, and people don't get it or they don't like it. And it's very easy to be defensive in those spaces and try to explain why you're wrong, why you don't get it. And that's not the point. So the idea is to very carefully listen, and that's an exercise we're going to ask you to do a little bit later today in our breakout sessions. And then we act. If there are creative solutions, we have to take action. So the goal of doing all of these measures is to see if our intention is having the impact we seek. Sometimes we have an intended impact, but often we are hearing impacts that we did not desire, we didn't intend, we didn't mean for. And too often, the conversations in museums have stopped. Well, that's not what I intended, so the impact that you're citing is wrong. Whatever happened to your, in your experience of this work of art, or what we're saying about it, that's not what we intended, so, oh well, that's not gonna work here if we're trying to be inclusive. So that denial happens more frequently than not. And so the idea is to listen and hear and turn some of those negatives, change our work so that they are dissipated, or change them so we discover new impacts that are actually beyond unintended outcomes, but beyond what we could have imagined. Let's see how we're doing on time. Okay. So a few examples. In 2017, we did an exhibition called Art of Rebellion, Black Art in the Civil Rights Movement, of the Civil Rights Movement. And this was part of a citywide observation of the 50-year anniversary of what's often called the riots, the 67 riots in Detroit. Many institutions and organizations in the area put on exhibitions exploring the impact of that moment and its ongoing experience that's in the city, in the heart of the city. We partnered with the Charles Wright Museum, our neighboring institution, the Charles Wright Museum of African American Art, to do co-institutional interpretive plans. We shared resources, and it's through this partnership that we used the term rebellion instead of riot, used their research, their historical experts. We also did 2 focus groups per exhibition, theirs and ours. We did in-community consultations with 30 young Metro Detroit nonprofit leaders, and we had an expert advisory panel with 9 participants who are scholars, poets, visual artists, and activists. And when we put the exhibition idea in front of them, what they said was there weren't enough Detroit artists, that the Detroit 67 story, the story of the city, wasn't strong enough, and we didn't integrate enough Detroit voices. So we created a section dedicated to telling a little bit of the story that led to the rebellion in '67, a few additional works by Detroit artists, a 7-minute new video with archival images and plus a reading space, and we added Detroiter Responds labels directly into the galleries that were written by our advisory panels, our advisory panelists. So we changed the exhibition, and we brought the voices directly into the show, and the findings, because we do exit surveys on these exhibitions, show that the satisfaction for this exhibition was quite high at almost 88%. The majority of visitors to this show, even though we had an uptick in African American visitors, the majority of visitors to the show are white. So part of this is about opening our own space, opening our own doors, and changing the way that we present. For the exhibition Dance, American Art, we showcased paintings that were considered, really, it's dance. What could be tough about this? We thought it was, the people organizing it thought it was relatively benign, and then a few works came into the checklist. And this was considered generally a benign show by staff, general visitors, but we did do some focus groups, and that elicited pretty agitated responses in some of the ways that African Americans were represented, but especially pained reactions from Native American focus group participants. That was because, you'll see in the lower right, there's a depiction of the ghost dance, and so there's deep concerns about the sensitive nature of interpreting and even showing something as sacred as this particular dance tradition. We had these focus groups of general visitors, people who self-identify as African American, and people who self-identify as Native American, and because within that run of focus groups, we had this issue arise, we had another charrette, like a workshop with Native American people from our region to look at how we could address this. So their frustrations came to the fore, and we worked through the interpretive mechanisms with them, with their suggestions, with their own writing, so that within this charrette, we ended up doing, we included a life-size video performed by Russ Tallchief, who performed the interpretation, giving his perspective on a dance that could be shared, and he was the person who sort of decided what could be shared and what would not. So turning over some of that space was one of the actions in that exhibition. I'm going to skip ahead so we can jump to some of the meatier material. In 2013, the DIA presented an exhibition of work by Shirin Neshat, a contemporary Iranian-American artist whose work is centered on photography, but also video installations. Her work in this installation featured video installations, but also photographs and images featuring imagery of women wearing veils, and integration of symbolic imagery, the veil, weapons, meaning guns in this case, and written text that's inscribed across the faces of the women's images. We did 4 focus groups for this. We tested these materials with Muslims, people from the Middle East, women who observe hijab and veil, plus community leaders who acted on the advisory panel. Because Neshat addresses issues of the culture and issues of women in Iran before and after the Islamic Revolution, through her work, the focus groups raised incredibly interesting issues and questions about how broadly this would be interpreted across Middle Eastern countries, Muslim countries, and the nuances I can go into another time, but their concern was that her perspectives would be projected onto all of them, and this is the tension that they would have to live with. There's also a challenge between how her films may be interpreted as documentary as opposed to aesthetic creations. So there was a lot of anger there, as was among Native Americans in the dance exhibition, as there were in many other kinds of exhibitions we've tested. What people do in these focus groups, or when we talk with them, is we often hear their anger. They're sharing openly with us. Often that anger is an expression of some kind of, we try to think about it differently, not anger at us, not anger at the subject matter, but some kind of system of grief that is happening. In this situation, people were concerned that the images of women who are wearing veils and the weapons and the texts that were actually contemporary poetry in Farsi were mistaken for Quranic verse. So the concern was that people would think of this as reinforcing stereotypes of Islam as oppressive to women and fundamentally violent. What they're sharing is the tension that they could see living with if the big museum on the hill did this exhibition for a mainstream audience. And we witnessed those tensions. So we did changes to the exhibition. We added things, we rearranged the art. But what we say, when we hear you, when we say we hear your concern, that's a welcoming gesture. And when we say that we'll act on it with you, present differently, we're saying we'll kind of live with you in that tension. That's the idea of building belonging. That's the idea of building trust. So we're at a little over our time. How are we doing, Kevin? Great. Okay, I'm just going to try to take 5 minutes and then we'll go. the last two bullets that I didn't address before, I'm going to now, which is cultural futurism. So I'm coming back to this census data. In many museums, where we look at breaking our traditional practices, talking with people, and that transformative change can be destabilizing. But this is where demographic data can help. And when we look at these numbers, it's easy to see, where our differences are and where we want to go. But there are other ways to consider these same numbers. Many of you have probably heard this. According to the 2010 census projections, the adult population in the US will shift to a majority-minority by 2045. Is everyone kind of familiar with this? So the most dramatic increases are predicted for bi and multiracial individuals, Hispanics, and Asians, and the categories we said are already a mess, and we're going to be thinking completely differently about identity, probably tomorrow. We don't have to wait till 2045. But here's the thing. Maybe you already know this too. The 2010 census also predicted that in 2020, the population of children ages 0 to 17 will compose this majority-minority. That's next year. That means these children are here. Children here today who are 16, 17, and younger are propelling these massive demographic shifts, these massive cultural changes, and this is making the need for cultural and racial awareness and new strategies for us as museums more urgent than ever. Above and beyond demographics, there is the moral imperative of the work of equitable racial and cultural representation. We need more than ever to act with our audiences to develop new tools and narratives to inform the ways we negotiate the racial landscape of America. I'm going to move forward and tell you a little bit about a project that we just opened. We reinstalled our Asian collections in November of 2018. And I love asking the question of what if. It makes us think in new ways, and I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of that later when we do our breakout sessions. So in 2015, the DIA started our planning for our next run of gallery installations, and this was our Asian collections. So we developed our processes to get us going out the door, and we were going to implement cross-divisional concept teams. That has been the nature of our work for many years. But because we're starting new, it was an opportunity to think differently about how we do things, using a little bit of systems thinking to think about what we're going to need, what is our future going to be. Most of our reinstallations stay up for the next 10, 15, sometimes 20 years. So what are the needs going to be in 10 and 15 years? How do we change our processes now to get to that point where we can serve more holistically? So there's a professor of business ethics who cites the moral imagination, coined by Edmund Burke, but puts it in a context asserting that we have an ethical responsibility to consider the human experience beyond the self, and she puts a challenge to us when we think about systems, the moral imagination. She encourages managers and companies to think more imaginatively, to step back from our established practices and traditions to develop a new mental model of what should be. So in this moment for us, stepping back meant looking to the future. How can we serve? And with this, with the Asian collections, these are the issues of racial representation, cultural definition, and traditional museum practice. These are the things to address. So we ended up changing our work, and this was to create community-inclusive concept teams. And we asked ourselves, this is touchy. What if we created spaces where the people who are typically excluded from the building of knowledge became the dominant voice in the room? What if we shared authority between experts working with non-experts to co-create our permanent collections installations? What if we looked to the predictive demographics to make us think to the future? So, in the whole process of developing the Asian reinstallation, we looked at the concept phase, which typically involves these three parties, the exhibitions, interpretation, curatorial, and we said, what would happen if we added community members? And we did. So rather than create a team of only museum staff, the Asian project was designed to reserve positions for community members. They applied for these positions, and they were selected based on certain criteria, including their identification and relationship with Asian communities in the area. And they were paid consultants. We did not ask them to do this for free. And the work was to create big ideas together, the ideas that would frame the installations. And for our focus groups, because we still test the ideas with people who may come to the museum or may not, all the past focus groups, when we used people representing our general visitorship, we reflected the DIA's demographics. But as you can see, the DIA's attendance does not even reflect the current demographics of our region. So for the Asian project, we flipped those focus groups so they were majority-minority, and looking at the demographic trends for our region indicates a majority of that majority are African Americans. So we constructed and designed our processes differently. I'm going to skip a little bit ahead. We've installed those galleries. We came upon, even with these best ideas for how we would practice, challenges where what we intended to happen, what did not have the impact. For instance, in the big idea for this, the Japanese art started with objects that activate the sacred. That was the kind of concept that came out of this team. That didn't fly with our focus groups because the objects didn't match their notions of sacred. It was rejected by 100% of our Japanese American focus group participants, from immigrant to fourth generation. Every single one of them objective. They didn't see the objects as activating that term sacred per se, even if the team was using that as shorthand. It was poorly translated. So the concern was that it reinforced notions of the mystical East. So we went back to the drawing board with our team and came up with the idea of objects that activate human responses of stillness and movement. And that could hold the Buddhist objects, that could hold the theater robes, that could hold many, many objects in the space. I'm going to skip. In the Indian and Southeast Asian gallery, the objects to the right are Hindu sculptures, and the big idea was that they were all made, because it's true, for temple contexts. And so the big idea was how the objects were made for temples, temple architecture, and were meant to connect Hindu practitioners to the gods. That sounds okay, right? I think it sounds okay. I grew up in a Hindu household. But this idea also did not test well once taken to the focus groups. While it conveyed accurate scholarship, and our art historians were happy, and many of the people on the team were happy, but when we put it in front of community members, focus groups of Indian Americans. The Hindus among them really appreciated the temple thing, that was fine, but saw the presentation as fundamentally cold and a bit ethnographic. It was unrelated to the way these temples, that they used objects in temples like these, as well as their home and in their everyday lives, and it didn't get to any aspects of the deep spirituality and devotional practice that was important to them. So we went back to the drawing board again, and to the original brainstorming themes, and one of our community consultants, Indian and Hindu, when he was asked early on to think about these objects and themes that we could draw from them, he just wrote an infinity symbol. We pulled that, the focus group feedback, and changed the big idea so that this space now focuses on the sculptures and images helping believers connect to the infinite divine, whether in temple contexts, in a home context, and unpacking the notion of the infinite divine. So including context and change some work here. So, at the end of the day, for this project, in addition to 11 community consultants who are part of the team, we ultimately engaged more than 250 people in content building ways. And all in all, when we consider people who participated in formative evaluation, this number rises to 400. And to date, this is probably the most extensive work an art museum of the DIA's type and scale has done to engage its communities in a permanent collection installation. It's a kind of incredible fact, and all of these activities have spilled into ongoing activities where programming is co-created with community organizations. Development, our fundraisers love new people to tap for money. And this is not easy or simple, and it's costly, but it's almost costlier not to do it. And community inclusive practices is co-creation, as I mentioned, is taking shape in development, programming, and across museum work. It's just changing the way we think and act, hopefully. I'm going to skip ahead because I'd like us to get into our activities. So here's the other part of this. Changing the way we do the work is one thing. Changing who we are is another. So here is some data from 2018 that shows, again, the Tri-County Census data from 2010, who our DIA visitors are, and then our staff makeup. We recognize that there is a problem across the board, and this museum has made pretty assertive steps toward equitable representativeness, and I'm happy to talk about more of that later. There are efforts to increase diversity on the staff, on the board, make new partnerships, change our collecting practices, but we are being very clumsy about it. This is a very tense and difficult transition that happens and puts people into conflict, puts practices and paradigms into conflict. And that's the question when we are involving communities and becoming more open. Are we flexible and resilient enough to absorb change and thrive? We're kind of in that transition point, and we have a long way to go. But so much of this is about challenging how we think individually and change how our institutions work. If the goal is to break down barriers between our communities, who we're representing, who we are, so we really can be welcoming, and to shift our spaces so that we are ones of belonging. So I'll stop there. And thank you.